The SAS operation known as Bravo 20 left 3 men killed and 4 men captured to be tortured by Iraqi soldiers during the 1990s. This horrific and deadly exercise is infamous today, having been discussed in various books, some of which were written by the operation's survivors, and is even the subject of a film starring Sean Bean. But certain accounts of the Bravo 20 operation have also come under scrutiny in the last 3 decades, leading to it becoming one of the most controversial SAS missions in history. Welcome to Wars of the World. On the night of January 23rd, 1991, 8 men who were part of the British Army Special Air Service were deployed to Iraq. Known as Bravo 20, the unit's call sign, they'd been tasked with gathering intelligence, setting up an observation post, and keeping an eye on and eventually destroying Scud missile launchers in the northwest of the country. This was of course during the Gulf War, an international conflict which took place between 1990 and 1991 and was led by the US. The conflict had been triggered by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, leading to the involvement of the United Nations, who sought to resolve the matter quickly. Bravo 20 were transported by helicopter, along with a secondary unit, Bravo 30, who were driving Land Rover vehicles. Bravo 20, however, had opted not to take any cars. Bravo 30 would reportedly abort their mission after seeing the conditions they'd be working in. Upon their deployment, Bravo 20 made their way to the first proposed location for the observation post. Accounts of the distance travelled, however, differ. According to Stephen Billy Mitchell, most commonly known as Andy McNabb, a surviving member of the unit who published a novel about the operation in 1993, the patrol walked over 12 miles. However, other accounts by Colin Armstrong, who used the pseudonym Chris Ryan for some time, and Mike Coburn, both of whom were members of the unit, stated that they walked just 1.2 miles, with Armstrong noting that the unit was dropped close to the observation spot due to the heavy weight of their packs. They soon discovered that the ground was too hard for an observation post to be dug. It wasn't long before the unit encountered their first major issue when they realized that they were unable to receive messages on their radio. Mitchell claimed that the group had been given the wrong radio frequencies, but in 2002, the BBC released a report noting that this was untrue. A former SAS member and Gulf veteran, Peter Ratcliffe, who is heavily critical of Mitchell and his claims, has noted his belief that Mitchell was the one to blame for the faulty radio equipment, pointing out that, as patrol commander, it was his job to make sure everything in his unit required was in good working order. Surviving member Colin Armstrong recalled that the mission had virtually been doomed from the start, stating, "We had very little information on the terrain, the weather, borders, anything. In fact, my map was dated back to 1944. The smock I was wearing was Second World War issue, so equipment was minimal. I can remember getting into the helicopter, and my quartermaster was next to me, and I said, 'This is a one-way ticket.'" The following day, on afternoon of January 24th, the unit believed they had been noticed by a young shepherd. Convinced they'd been compromised, Bravo 20 began preparing to withdraw, dumping their heavy equipment which they no longer required. However, before they could leave the area, the men heard what they believed to be a tank approaching. They subsequently went into defensive positions and set up their anti-tank weapons, waiting for the vehicle to emerge. But it never did. There was no tank. There was only a bulldozer. The driver of the bulldozer, though, saw the men and began to retreat. The men began to organize their exit from the area, but according to Mitchell, they soon became engaged in a shootout with Iraqi soldiers and armored personnel carriers. Armstrong recalled, "We only had 2 weapons. I knew we were in a bad place. I wasn't interested in the Iraqi army. I knew the problem we were going to have is the cold and the weather." One major critic of the novel, Bravo 20, written by patrol leader Mitchell under the pen name Andy McNabb, is Michael Asher, a desert explorer and historian. Asher has been extremely outspoken about his issues with the Bravo 20 novel, as well as Colin Armstrong's book about the operation, The One That Got Away. In 2001, Asher interviewed the Bedouin family, who discovered the patrol. According to them, they were unsure of the men's identities and followed them for a short time. They eventually fired a few warning shots, which led the unit to return fire before putting distance between them. The Guardian wrote that according to Asher's eyewitnesses, the unit was, quote, challenged by a small group of lightly armed locals. There was no vicious and violent shootout with military members as described by Mitchell in his novel. Michael Coburn wrote in his account of the operation, which he later published under the name Soldier 5, that there was at least one armoured personnel carrier present, and that the men encountered heavy machine gun fire. Similarly, Armstrong wrote, quote, one of the other men saw an armoured car carrying a .50 caliber machine gun pull up. Somehow, I never saw that. Following this alleged firefight, the unit continued their plan to be extracted from the country. According to the British Standard Operating Procedure, if the patrol encountered an emergency or had no radio contact, they should return to the initial infiltration point, as a helicopter would briefly land there every 24 hours. However, the unit was unable to do this. The problem being that while they had headed to the landing site, the helicopter never showed up. This was later attributed to the helicopter pilot becoming ill while en route to the infiltration point, which saw him abandon the trip mid-flight. More failures later emerged when it was discovered that while the unit was unable to receive messages over the radio, they were able to send them, and they attempted to contact overhead Allied jets. A US pilot did hear the messages, but for unknown reasons was unable to help the men out by raising their issue. Reportedly, numerous aircraft were dispatched to the men's last known location to try and find them, though these attempts to do so were fruitless. Later that same day, an SAS daily record log showed that a tactical beacon, or TACBE, from the unit was received, along with the log noting that it was, quote, reasonable to assume that they were moving south. It was believed that the group were heading south towards Saudi Arabia to be extracted, but it turned out that instead they were heading northwest towards the Syrian border. It was later revealed by Coburn that indeed, the unit had determined that Syria should be their escape location, should things go wrong and they needed to leave Iraq. There is some suggestion that this location was agreed upon following some advice given to them by a commanding officer for B Squadron at the time. Former SAS officer Peter Ratcliffe later stated that this change in plan meant that the unit was unable to be located and rescued. Some criticism, however, was also levelled at Patrol Commander Mitchell, who declined suggestions from superior officers that the men take vehicles with them, as this would have given them an easier time when fleeing the country. Later that night, the group became separated after failing to follow standard emergency procedures. While Mitchell attempted to contact a passing Allied aircraft using a tactical beacon, 3 members of the unit continued walking. Those members included Armstrong, Vincent Phillips, and Malcolm McGowan. Coburn and 3 other unit members, Stephen Lane, Ian Pring, and Robert Consiglio, stayed behind with Mitchell. Both groups separately began making their way to the Syrian border. It is unclear why Armstrong and the 2 other men went off without the remainder of the group. On the night of January 25th, things took a turn when Phillips began suffering from hypothermia. During the day, the 3 men had hidden out in a tank berm, and when night fell, they left towards the Syrian border. Soon, Phillips became so unwell that he could no longer hold his weapon and handed it to McGowan. His condition continued to deteriorate as the men trudged onwards, and at one point Phillips became so confused that he thought his black gloves were his hands, and that his skin had turned pitch black, and he began to yell out in terror. Confused and scared, Phillips wound up separated from his 2 teammates. Armstrong later recalled, quote, I was with Vince and he was dying, and I tried everything to convince him to keep moving. It was just a disaster. The main enemy was the weather. Phillips later died, alone and separated from his unit at the age of 36. Armstrong and McGowan would later report that they searched for him in the darkness for around 20 minutes before deciding to move on without him, with Armstrong hoping that Phillips was still alive. At around noon the following day, January 26th, Armstrong and McGowan were spotted by a goat herder. The 2 men discussed executing the herder so he couldn't alert Iraqi soldiers, but eventually decided against this, with McGowan opting to speak with the herder in order to locate a vehicle. Armstrong, however, remained behind. They agreed that McGowan would return at 6:30 PM, and while he took Phillips' weapon with him, he left behind his belt kit so that he wouldn't, quote, cut such an aggressive figure. McGowan began walking with the herder for 4 hours until the 2 came across a group of men in a Toyota Land Cruiser. Armstrong would later report that McGowan shot and killed an unarmed man while running towards the vehicle before shooting a further 2 men, both of whom were armed. However, he ran out of ammunition and was apprehended as he attempted to steal the Toyota. Notably, Mitchell told a different version of events in his book, explaining that the herder had parted ways with McGowan after giving him directions to a hut near 2 vehicles. McGowan was subsequently met with violent forces, compelling him to kill a uniformed Iraqi soldier in his attempt to steal one of the cars. Moments later, quote, 6 or 7 more soldiers emerged from the hut. McGowan managed to take down 3 of them before his gun jammed, and he was apprehended while sitting in one of the vehicles. McGowan in 2002 agreed in part with his version of the story, stating that he came across a soldier while nearing a vehicle. Quote, I brought up my trump card, which was Mohaba, and he said nothing, and I carried on talking, and then he made a dash for the vehicle. I shot him in the head. A single shot. McGowan then noted that while more soldiers emerged, he was already out of ammo. Phillips had not reloaded his gun since January 24th. McGowan was then captured. Meanwhile, later that evening, Mitchell, Coburn, Lane, Pring and Consiglio stole a taxi at gunpoint, with Consiglio pretending to be wounded and dying at the side of the road. Mitchell would later write in his book that the occupants of the taxi were all evicted, and they subsequently drove to the nearest checkpoint where Lane shot and killed a soldier, and other members of the group took the lives of a further 2 more Iraqi soldiers. Armstrong, though, noted in his second-hand account that the group had been driving to the checkpoint by one of the taxi's occupants, who raised the alarm, forcing the group to continue their journey on foot. Michael Asher has noted his criticisms of Mitchell's account in the years since, stating that there was no gunfight and no reported Iraqi casualties during this time, despite what Mitchell claims. Asher claimed that upon interviewing the policeman who stopped the car, he discovered that the real story is much closer to Armstrong's version of events, adding that when he spoke to the policeman, quote, there were many similar details that backed up what I heard from the Iraqis. The following morning, on January 27th, Mitchell and his 4 men came into contact with locals and police officers. At around 2 AM during the encounter, Consiglio was shot and killed by armed civilians. Shortly afterwards, Ling died of hypothermia, while Pring, Mitchell and Coburn were captured. Coburn was also shot in the arm and the ankle during the conflict. The 3 men joined McGowan, who was still in custody. The foursome were moved several times, and each time they were met with aggressive torture and interrogation. While Mitchell appeared to write about the extremes, such as teeth pulling and burning, McGowan would later clarify that such incidents, quote, did not happen. It is inconceivable that any such incidents could have occurred without them being discussed or being physically obvious. The men were ultimately released on March 5th, with a Red Cross representative describing them as being in good shape. Meanwhile, Colin Armstrong was still on his own. After McGowan's capture, he continued on towards the Syrian border as originally planned. Speaking with Forces.net, he recalled, quote, it was 7 days without food, and the last 3 days without water. I'd actually drank some water that was from a chemical plant and was full of effluent which burned my mouth. So for the last 3 nights, I had nothing and was walking about 40 kilometers a night. I started hallucinating and seeing visions of my daughter. It was that vivid, I was putting my hand out to get a hold of her and she was talking to me. After 7 days, having walked 186 miles, he made it to the border town of Abu Kamal. He added, quote, I had cold injuries, I'd lost 38 pounds in weight, I had no toenails, and there was pus coming out of all the areas that had blistered. I had bed sores and a damaged liver. Armstrong was later taken to the British Embassy in Syria before being returned home. According to Forces.net, he is not bitter about what he endured, stating, it's war, the fog of war, the confusion of war. We were getting out there to get into a scrap. Yes, mistakes were made, but one thing with the regiment is that they try to learn from mistakes. There wouldn't be any more young men having to walk 7 days and 8 nights, so you've got to take the positive side. Following their ordeals, both Stephen Mitchell and Colin Armstrong penned books about the events of January 1991. Mitchell used the pen name Andy McNabb and published Bravo 20 in 1993, while Armstrong adopted the pseudonym Chris Ryan and wrote The One That Got Away, which was published in 1995. Despite their use of fake names, they used the real-life details of their fellow unit members in the books. Former SAS member Peter Ratcliffe criticized this decision, noting, it is insensitive on Armstrong and Mitchell's parts to hide behind pseudonyms when they named their dead colleagues in their books, in deliberate contravention of the regiment's traditions. Mitchell is also known to have estimated the unit had killed 250 enemies, but this number has been long questioned, with many critics noting that it's unclear where the figure came from. Additionally, Mitchell never mentioned this number in any of his debriefs following the events of January 1991. Further criticism has been levelled at Armstrong in particular for reportedly vilifying Sergeant Phillips in his novel. Armstrong wrote that Phillips had compromised the patrol because he hadn't killed a shepherd and subsequently seemed to give up after the group split in two. Both books, however, were extremely successful and led to lucrative careers for both Mitchell and Armstrong. In 2004, Michael Coburn, a New Zealand-born surviving member of the unit, attempted to publish his own book on the events of January 1991, but was met with resistance when the British government attempted to silence him. Speaking with the Irish Times, he noted how the books of Mitchell and Armstrong had been vetted and approved by Britain's Ministry of Defence, but that he was having trouble receiving the same treatment. He claimed, quote, "Oh, if Bin Laden wasn't around, I'd be enemy number one. I've no doubt about it. The way they've gone after me over the years is amazing." Coburn's book, Soldier 5, is described as a straightforward account of Bravo 20, with none of the heroics of killing the enemy, which featured in the books of Mitchell and Armstrong. He believed that much of the unit's failures lay with poor leadership decisions and bad intelligence. They had been dumped in an area of around 3,000 Iraqi soldiers, had broken radio equipment, no vehicles, and a bad escape route. He described the attitude of superior officers who treated the unit as expendable, adding, "There's always an element that you may have to sort yourself out in the end, but for people to turn back at headquarters and say they're not even going to try anyway, well, that's just not acceptable in any way, shape or form. If you're going to put people in harm's way, you've got a duty to do your utmost to get them back, and if you're not, you've got to tell them." Coburn recalled that he started writing his own book about the events after speaking with an SAS officer who'd overheard senior officers at the time discussing a call for the patrol to be extracted. He stated that those officers, quote, "classed that as premature. That decision basically cost the lives of 3 men." For 5 years, since 1999, Coburn was suppressed by the British government, which attempted to have Soldier 5 banned. They spent about £7 million of British taxpayer money to do so. The British Ministry of Defence claimed that Coburn had breached a confidential contract he signed in 1996, a contract that came about on the back of the publications of Bravo 20 and The One That Got Away. Coburn, though, argued that he and his fellow soldiers had no choice but to sign the papers, as they were ordered to do so, and added that the story of Bravo 20 was now widely known and in the public domain. How can it be considered confidential? Notably, a British Gulf War commander wrote about the operation even before the publication of Mitchell's and Armstrong's books. In 2004, Coburn won the right to publish his book. However, the Ministry of Defence subsequently sought to seize the profits from the book's publication. They won the rights to the profits, which Coburn had planned to share with the families of the deceased and the surviving unit members. Jaded by his experiences with the British government, he noted, quote, "I've been treated worse than the Iraqis treated me in prison." He added that his book will likely be the last released by an SAS insider, unless someone can gain explicit permission from the Ministry of Defence.